Have you ever wondered why a needle actually breaks? Hi, I'm Sarah from sewingmastery.com, and I was doing some sewing today and thinking about some questions that were recently asked via email to me of needle questions and breakage and why is my needle breaking? So I am in the middle of filming a new online course, so I stopped. This is a new Bernina Embroidery Essentials course to help you master your embroidery machine. Plus, we have other courses to help you master decorative stitches and all those wonderful machine accessories that you might have bought but haven't actually got them out to use. Now, a lot of our courses, we use a lot of different kinds of needles. And needles are something that once you really get a grasp of why they're made for certain techniques, it's a lot easier to have a whole collection of needles and know which one for which project. But eventually something happens and you need to change the needle and you kind of go, well, why did it break? Or why am I needing to change to a different kind of needle? So I actually have 15 different reasons needles can break. So number one, when you have a spool of thread that has this little indent for you to store your thread, when it's on a sewing machine, sometimes the thread can actually get caught in kind of the thread holder. Well, if it gets caught and you are sewing, the thread gets super tight and it will bend the needle and then it will usually then hit your throat plate. And that's number one, a broken needle. But then you think, well, why did it happen? And you're looking around your bobbin area and your needle and such, and then you realize the problem is way up here. Speaking of other things about your thread spool, a lot of us have horizontal spool pins that we place our spools on. And with that, we are advised to put a spool cap on. Well, if the cap is not close enough to the spool and there's a little gap, sometimes the thread will drop in there and also get tight and come out with the same result as the first issue. So spool caps can be a culprit. So as you can see, I'm in the middle of sewing blocks together and I actually prefer to use a thread stand. It's currently just sitting kind of behind my machine, and then with that I don't have to worry about any thread getting hooked around the spool cap or part of the spool itself. Speaking of how your machine is threaded, if the thread gets hooked around a guide more than once, maybe it wraps it around or it gets caught on a guide extra, that extra drag can also put that strain on the needle. And once again, it will break. And then you rethread the machine, hopefully undoing the thread where that guide might have been kind of wrapped around a few times. That will make a big difference. Now, when people start working on larger projects, this is my next thing I see when needles break, is when fabric projects are heavy, we tend to feel the need to push them through our machine, help them go through. And you know what the easiest way to help with that problem is to lengthen your stitch length. Let the machine's teeth actually help you pull or get the fabric through the machine. So what actually happens is if you're pushing and helping that fabric, you're going to eventually tend to bend that needle just enough towards the back of the opening in the throat plate and it will hit. Once it hits, that usually breaks your needle as well. So take a look at the throat plate on your machine. If you are noticing little tick marks or penetrations and indents that weren't there when you first bought it, that's because needles have broken and hit that. Now that can lead to other issues with your sewing machine because as you sew, thread can get caught on those rough spots. Now often your sewing machine technician can buff those out at your next service. Now if it has become too jaggedy and rough, it might be time for a new throat plate. Now I'll just throw this up here because FOF and Viking users, your throat plate has a little notch on the back left corner. That is there for part of the cutting system, and that was not you breaking your needle on your throat plate at all. A common question in our sewing mastery classes of, oh my goodness, I've already ruined my throat plate. But you haven't. Next, When the needle is too small for the thickness of fabric. Here's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So let's say you have all your pieces cut out for a fun new tote bag. You sew these two pieces together, this little pocket assembly is together, but as you progress through the project, you're going to notice that layers that are 2 layers turn into 4 layers, and 4 layers turn into 8 layers, and you have interfacing and handles and other thicknesses. So by the time you get towards the end of that project, you are probably needing a much larger needle, sharper needle, and one that can handle those thicker layers. So eventually, if you hit those full 8+ layers with a traditional size needle, like a size 80, it will give out just because it's just not strong enough. So then replace it with a larger needle, such as a denim needle, a top stitch needle, or a microtex needle. Another culprit for needles breaking is when the needle is not inserted as high as it needs to go for the machine to work correctly. So you're putting in a new needle and you get it up and then you tighten the screw, not realizing that it should have gone a little bit higher. So now that point is lower than it should. When that needle goes down into your bobbin area, it's going to hit something. And that will also lead to probably a broken needle. Little frustration. And here's the way you can help make sure you always get your needle to the highest positions. 2 things. Number 1, you can use a needle inserter that will help make sure you're lifting the needle as high as possible before tightening that screw. Also, by using your needle threader to check to see if that needle is at the proper height, if the needle threader does not line up with your needle hole, that is clue number 1 that it is not as high as it should be. Speaking of tightening needle screws, if you don't get it tight enough, you will find that after a little sewing and a little vibration, that needle will just fall out. And at the wrong time, that needle could hit something and just again, break in two. And that's no fun. But I do caution you because there is a fine line between a needle tightened just right and a needle that is over tightened with that screw. You can actually damage the screw if you go too much. So you do have to find that happy medium where you need to tighten it so it doesn't fall out, but not over tighten it so the screw can continue to hold the needle in. Let's talk about things that happen down below the throat plate. The hook that creates the stitch and the bobbin case that holds your bobbin. So a couple things. When you're working with heavy fabrics, if you get any jarring, again, the needle can kind of move and it can actually hit the hook or the bobbin case, leaving little needle strikes. And with that, that usually will, if it doesn't break the needle, it will definitely put a dent into the point, making it kind of sound a little popping when you go to sew next time. But you will find that if it breaks, that you want to go down there and see if there's any rough spots. If there is any rough spots on your hook or on the bobbin case itself, make sure your local service technician can also buff those out because rough spots can lead to thread catching while the stitch is being formed down and connecting with the bobbin case. So you will find that once a needle breaks, there's sometimes more things that happen because it kind of starts a chain reaction that can affect the way your machine works. So if you are having any machine issues, let's see if there has been some needle strikes or gouges that have affected some of those moving parts down below. Sometimes when we sew over something that's really thick, the needle will bend but not break. So once you have a bent needle, you are probably playing a little chicken with your sewing machine of whether that stitch is going to form, whether your thread maybe starts breaking, or maybe the needle starts hitting other things, and that can lead to other frustrating parts of sewing. So if you don't know if the needle is bent, it's not obvious, go ahead and put a new needle in and see if that solves the problem. Some needles, when you pull them out of the package, are just bad to start with. I mean, think about the manufacturing that has to go into making a needle. I heard once that it takes like almost 50 different passes for a needle to actually be honed into the shape that it needs. From the tip to the groove in the middle, the hole, and then the top part that's a whole different shape with the flat side on the back. Now, don't quote me on what it takes to make a needle. I really don't have a clue, but I can think about the amount of places that something has to carve that little piece of metal into a sharp point. And there'll be a time where probably something isn't just absolutely perfect. So opening a new pack of needles does not guarantee that every single needle you ever put your hands on is perfect and ready to use. So if you have problems, change out that needle one more time and give it another try. Now, sewing over pins or even sewing over a zipper can be a culprit and needles can break. So pins, I am always a fan of sewing up to a pin, but pulling them out before I stitch over it. Most of the time, you're going to be able to just kind of jump the log or jump over the pin. But there's plenty of times where you think you're going to miss it and then you hear the little tick, and now the tip is not as sharp. You are going to find that there is a time where you can hit a straight pin so square that the pin will break, the needle will break, and it just sounds awful. So make sure that you take the time, sew up to your pins, pull them out before going over them. Speaking of zippers, same thing. Hand turn your needle through those zipper teeth as you're crossing over and creating that construction seam for where that zipper either begins or ends. Now this next one applies to exactly what I've been sewing today. I actually have a straight stitch throat plate on my machine, meaning if I sew zigzag, my needle will hit the throat plate. Now, a lot of machines these days are super smart and will have an option for you to tell it, hey, keep my needle in the center needle position. Don't let me pick a stitch that would go off to the side and break my needle. Now, even though you have that option, I do find students don't always engage it. So you're sewing straight, 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 and then tomorrow I come back in, turn the machine on, and need to do a zigzag. If I hadn't told the machine that I have a straight stitch throat plate on, I get to put a new needle in immediately. On a similar note, a great tip for those of you using a 1/4-inch foot, and if you've looked at your 1/4-inch foot, it is traditionally a center needle position foot, meaning, once again, if you pick a zigzag, it's gonna hit the metal part of the foot. A little trick is to activate that throat plate option for center needle position on your machine. And you can just pretend that you have a straight stitch throat plate on and let your machine make sure that you don't pick the wrong stitch with the foot that won't let you stitch from side to side. And after a while, needles just get weak. The more you use it, the weaker it can get. And eventually it just gives up the ghost and just breaks. And so with that, there's really no time, rhyme, or reason of why a needle breaks in the middle of the project. It could just be its time. The nice thing about needles is the cheapest thing that you change for your sewing machine to continue to run smoothly. So don't skimp out on needles. Know immediately when you are frustrated, the first thing you should do is change your needle and double check that you have the right type of needles. We have a whole series of needle videos, they're super short, that we'll link to right up here, where you can check out all the different types of needles as I explain what their uses are and how they will benefit for different types of fabrics and projects. So if any of these tips have been helpful for you, make sure you give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you would like to invite me to join you in your sewing studio for some online courses, check out the links below. I look forward to joining you in your sewing studio with one of our online courses to help you master your sewing machine, embroidery machine, or serger.